Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this event sponsored by the Center for American Studies and Research. My name is Patrick McGreevy. Today we have a debate on the Middle East policies of the Bush and Obama administrations. And featuring Rami Khouri and Michael Young. For those of you who read the Daily Star from time to time, these two men need no introduction, although you probably notice that their feature or their articles never appear on the same page the same day. Today we have the privilege of making them confront each other. Rami Khouri is the director of the Issam Ferris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. He is a syndicated columnist, and he regularly appears on television and print media and radio in the U.S. and in other parts of the world. He's also a former Little League chief umpire. Maybe I should have said that first.
Baseball chief umpire.
Yes, baseball. That's right. People might not know that. Michael Young is the opinion page editor of the Daily Star. Before that, he was the English publications editor for the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. And he also appears regularly in print and radio and television media, where he comments on Middle Eastern affairs. So let me tell you a little bit about the format today. We are going to begin with Rami Khouri speaking about the Bush administration's foreign policy in the Middle East, and then Michael Young will give his assessment of that, and then we will see if they need to interact with each other about that. We didn't have any elaborate planning like the Sarah Palin and Joe Biden debate, so we assume that they will be civil.
Who's Sarah?
Who's Sarah? After that part of the debate, the second part will focus on the Obama administration's Middle East foreign policy, and then Michael Young will speak first, and then Rami, and then we will let them interact. And we hope to get all of that done in about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will turn to the audience for questions and comments. So we begin with Rami Khouri.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to be here with two close friends, Patrick and Michael, and Michael and I have worked together very closely for many years, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to set him straight in public, and which we often talk in private, but I'm sure he will want to reciprocate the gesture. But I think it's important to go through this process as we've done many times, he and I privately, talking about the different perspectives on the Bush administration and the United States foreign policy in general in the Middle East. In 7 minutes, let me just quickly say that I think the vast majority of what the George Bush administration has done in the 8 years or so in the Middle East has been predominantly a calamity for the United States, for the people of the Middle East, and for anybody else who has to work in the Middle East or has suffered the consequences of some of the trends that have emanated from the Middle East as a consequence of the incoherence of the leaders of the Middle East themselves, first of all, and then also the interaction with a rejuvenated incoherence that comes, an extremism that comes out of Washington. And I say it's a calamity because I think in almost every single case where the United States has been involved in the Middle East in the last 7-8 years, the United States has either not achieved its principal objectives or has achieved consequences that are counterproductive to what it intended to achieve and counterproductive to its rhetoric. It has been a case of cumulative, continuous, and calamitous mistakes in foreign policy that is, I think, almost unprecedented in not just modern history, but perhaps the entire experience of foreign intervention in the Middle East going back to the Emperor Trajan. It's a very serious case study of wrong policies, misdiagnosis, and bad actions, one coming after the other. And if you just look across the region quickly, you look at where the United States has been involved, every single case, I think, has turned out badly. There's only two things that I can point to that I think the United States can be credited for doing. And I would say those are the removal of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist police state regime. Even though I think the entire process was wrong and counterproductive, they did take away a pretty awful fellow with a terrible police state, brutal regime that was only in degree worse than many of the other regimes in the region. Not all regimes in the Arab world are dictatorial and brutal, but about half of them are. And the Iraqi regime was probably among the worst. So I think removing Saddam Hussein, despite the other problems with that process, was an achievement. And the second achievement, I think, was working with partners around the world to bring about the International Lebanese Tribunal to try the people who will be accused of killing Hariri and the 20 other people or so who were killed in Lebanon in the last 2.5, 3 years. I think those two, the court achievement is actually a really significant one, which the Americans were very much involved with. And other than those two things, I can't think of any serious foreign policy achievement that the United States can chalk up. In Palestine, they stayed away from the peace process, rediscovered it in the 7th year, and as in the biblical period, in the 7th year it lay fallow, nothing happened. They weren't serious, they weren't even-handed, they weren't persistent, and they certainly did not work for diplomatic breakthroughs based on the rule of law or the sense of equitable conflict resolution based on equal rights for Arabs and Israelis. Intervening in the civil war or the civil strife within Palestine on the side of Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah was a terrible mistake, which they, I think, repeated to an extent in Lebanon. To choose sides in an internal dispute, ideological military dispute inside an Arab country is about the worst kind of foreign policy that you can do. And it resulted in Palestine with the almost total discrediting and political marginalization to many extents of Fatah and Abu Mazen. In Lebanon, you had a similar situation, not quite as stark, but where the U.S. came in very heavily on the side of the government March 14 majority coalition, spurring a strong reaction from the Hezbollah-led opposition, leading to confrontations which were happening before, but it just heightened the tensions and again led to a situation where with street fighting and other things, the United States basically found itself forced into a coalition through its proxy partners in the government, a coalition between the two, March 14 and March 8. The U.S. allies all over the region, broadly speaking, are more vulnerable and less credible than they were 8 years ago. Most Arab moderates, as they call them in Washington, are weaker now with their own people and with international credibility. The opponents of the U.S., people like Hezbollah, like Hamas, Muslim Brothers, even some tribal movements here and there, the opponents of the U.S. have been emboldened, are stronger, and in many cases are actually sharing power in one way or another, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas or the judicial courts, the guys in Somalia, or whoever it may be. So the American intervention in the region, politically and militarily, has stimulated a much stronger counter-reaction, which has led to a kind of a not a Cold War, but a regional confrontation where the two sides are actually equally balanced, I think. There's a stalemate between friends of America and opponents of America. The United States today has less respect, less impact, and less influence and less credibility than it had 8 years ago throughout the Middle East. And this is heightened by the fact that it plays virtually no significant direct mediation role right now, and the major mediations in the Middle East are largely undertaken by other people, the Turks, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Arab League, Saudis, and the Europeans to an extent, and the UN and others. And I think this is a consequence of policy. And not only do people in the Middle East, broadly speaking, respect the U.S. less, most people who are now willing to confront it also fear it less. So the United States is in a position now where it has less respect, less influence, and less fear than it did before. And if you don't have respect, influence, or fear, you don't have very much if you want to be a diplomatic actor or player in the region. The Arab democratic movement, indigenous Democrats, are dormant throughout the region. They have been largely frightened or discredited by too close an association with the United States, as well as the hopelessness of trying to deal with autocratic regimes which have been, in most cases, emboldened by the developments in the region, predominantly the U.S.-led war on terror after 9/11. And so there's a cycle here of autocratic Arab regimes being stronger, security being the defining driving force in terms of many American-Arab bilateral relationships, to the point where security chiefs, mukhabarat chiefs, are the key interlocutors for Condoleezza Rice when she comes to visit the region. And this, in turn, makes it almost impossible for anybody working for indigenous democracy and reform to have any impact. So they've all either immigrated or just lied dormant now. So the Arab democracy movement has completely gone quiet. Terrorism is a bigger problem now than it was 8 years ago. It's a different kind of terrorism that the region faces, with the springing up of small groups like Fatah al-Islam and Jund al-Sham and these groups and many others that probably are all over the place. Much harder to define, much harder to defeat. So terrorism, I think, is a bigger problem. You have a problem with the pattern of the last 8 years building on a previous pattern, which is not only the fault of the U.S., but the fault of many people in the region, which is we now have a wide cycle of violence in a region that had been previously defined by intermittent episodes of violence. Now we have political violence routinely used all over the place by Arab governments, by Arab opposition groups, by terror groups, by Israelis, Turks, Iranians, Americans, Brits, and everybody who's in the region routinely uses political violence, terrorism, occupation, resistance, whatever you want to call it, as a routine conduct. And you have the last point I would make is that the total consequence of all these factors, and I'm just pointing out the sort of main ones here, the total consequence is that lots and lots of people in the Middle East, and I would say if you take Iran, Turkey, and the Arab world, you have something like 500 million people and something in that range. I would say we're talking about 250 to 300 million people who now actively oppose, defy, resist, and politically and sometimes militarily fight the United States and its allies in the region. We have a much more complex regional confrontation in which Islamist movements are strong. You have little groups of terrorist groups here and there. You have tribal movements and other movements springing up that are using anti-American resistance as a motivating, mobilizing, and rationalizing force in their movements. Opposing the U.S. has become a motivation for many people, and you saw it downtown with the signs of Condoleezza Rice and Signora and the opposition making fun of the Lebanese government, that they were little kids that Condoleezza Rice was teaching in school. And the people like Hamas and Hezbollah and others openly say that defying and resisting the United States is one of their strategic goals, as well as Israel and resisting other people as well. And finally, the international global energy market, I think, is not better off today than it was years ago. And I think the symbol of this is the Somali pirates hijacking a $100 million Saudi tanker. I mean, there is no stronger symbol of the collective incoherence, instability, recklessness, and vulnerability that defines this entire region than a group of Somali pirates taking a Saudi oil tanker hostage. And most of the countries of the region and the world and NATO and everybody not being able to figure out what to do about it. So we're dealing with a region, I'll stop here so that I don't go over my time, and we'll talk about other things later, but we're talking about a region that is much more volatile, unstable, violent, confrontational than it was 7 or 8 years ago. I think much of this can be traced back to policies of the Bush administration and reactions to them. I think it's important to say that not everything is a responsibility of the Bush administration. A lot of these problems are anchored in disjointed, incoherent, incompetent, and occasionally criminal Arab governance systems that have failed their own people to a large extent in much of the region over the last 40, 50 years. But it's a cycle of Arab incompetence, Israeli aggression and occupation and disregard for the rule of law, and Western military intervention. These are all now wrapped up in a cycle which culminated and was prodded in many cases by the American-led invasion of Iraq and the wider global war on terror, which have been, I think, collectively a calamity, but challenge us to undertake a serious analysis of collectively together to look at this. What's the problem with the Americans? What's the problem with the Europeans, the Arabs, the Israelis, etc.? So I think this is where we are, and I hope the future is better than the recent past. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I mean, by and large, I think Rami has taken an attitude towards the United States which I don't really have a problem with in terms of judging the efficiency of its actions. Has it succeeded? Has it not succeeded? And by and large, I think there's a lot with what he said that I don't disagree with. I disagree with certain points where I feel he wants to have his cake and eat it too. He says one thing and the contrary. For example, I'm happy to see that Rami agrees with me that Iraq was actually a good thing. The planning was a disaster. But if already we can agree that Iraq, the removal of Saddam Hussein, was a good thing, I think we've gone a long way in agreement rather than disagreement. But I'd like to, if you'll allow me, maybe we can disagree more in this session where we were supposed to throw things at each other. Now I'd like to take just a little bit of a different perspective on American behavior in the last, this stage, 8 years. As you know, America has been judged or misjudged or condemned on the grounds of how it has formulated its policy in the Middle East. The argument being that the US has behaved unilaterally, that it hasn't taken into consideration the wishes of its allies, that in a way this is a neoconservative administration, we're still living with that canard. My argument will be that basically the Bush administration, by and large, and I will explain which exceptions, by and large, has basically been pretty much like any other US administration in the Middle East. It has made errors, quite a few. It has had some successes, not many, but it has had some significant successes, I think. Lebanon and Iraq, the removal of Saddam being one of them. But this is not at all a position where I'm going to defend the Bush administration. I think what we need to do is get out of the cycle of judgment of George W. Bush that has become so based on abhorrence for the man that in a way no one has really, I think, given the administration a sort of cool-eyed analysis of what is good and what is bad. This is an administration that's made mistakes. It's also had successes. In that way, it's really little different than the Clinton administration. I suspect it will be little different than the Barack Obama administration. So if I could just outline a little bit for you that approach. What has been different? What has been similar? And why is this not an administration in a way that has really behaved unilaterally, with the exception, of course, of Iraq? Well, today, just in terms of international relationships, the United States, since I would say 2004, has already started going back to an equilibrium in its relationships with the international community, meaning Europe, meaning China, meaning Russia. And I believe that actually Iraq had much less of an impact in American relations with Europe and with China and Russia than many people think. Of course, we all remember that incident when Dominique de Villepin went to the UN Security Council and with his white hair waving took a position of, a moral position opposing the United States' effort to legalize at the UN Security Council the war in Iraq. Of course, this is before people knew that the Philippines was trying to label Nicolas Sarkozy a thief. But the point I'm making here is, other than what happened at the UN Security Council, quite frankly, I think that Iraq was not as significant an impact, had not as significant an impact on American relations with the international community as many people think. Whether Donald Rumsfeld referred to Europe as old Europe or not, the international community got over it, and as you all remember well, Chirac and Bush got on very well in Lebanon in 2004 in the passage of 1559, the resolution. So let's look separately at these different incidents. The Iraq War, I would argue, is really the exception confirming the rule that the United States has by and large acted within an international consensus in the Middle East. And I will try to argue why individually. Iraq is the exception to confirm, this is the exception confirming that rule. Indeed, the United States, in its planning for the Iraq War and its preparation for the Iraq War, I would say it was a disaster in terms of its preparation, in terms of planning for the post-war process, the hubris involved. Of course, we know the manipulation of intelligence. The United States went into Iraq, to my mind, it did indeed, as Rami said, undermine its objectives. I think Iraq was a good idea, that the United States itself screwed up. I agree entirely with him that the removal of Saddam Hussein, how can anyone not applaud the removal of a mass murderer who, by all accounts, would probably have handed over to another mass murderer one of his two sons, and this cycle would have gone on indefinitely. The only way to remove Saddam Hussein was through military force. That does not mean, of course, that the United States, we should give them a buy on the post-war planning, on the arrogance, and on, quite frankly, the utter inability to understand Iraqi dynamics. You can condemn that, but we can still defend the war as having a net positive result. And the surge, of course, because I think it's quite important to take into consideration that there is a certain impression that whenever the United States gets bogged down in wars, it tends to lose these wars. It's a sort of a Vietnam syndrome. I think in Iraq we saw a different situation. The surge has, to a large extent, worked, so that even today an advisor to Barack Obama, I think 10 days ago, said Iraq is yesterday's war. I hope that's correct. Of course, things can go wrong. But my point is, we have to understand that the administration did adjust, and without in any way neglecting the fact that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people were killed because of US errors. I'm not condoning that. But other than Iraq, if we go outside of Iraq, let's look a bit across the region. The situation in Iran. The United States has by and large worked within, I would say almost too rigidly within the context of an international consensus. It's worked through the 5+1 group, it's worked through the International Atomic Energy Agency. As you all know well, a year ago in December, there was the release of this national intelligence estimate, which basically virtually took a military option off the table, because in that estimate, the intelligence agencies came to a consensus that Iran had stopped its nuclear weapons program, I believe, in 2003. So the administration accepted that consensus, despite the fact that Bill Cheney and his people would have perhaps were pushing for a conflict. Bush accepted that consensus, and indeed the United States prevented, it seems from what we know from press reports, prevented Israel from beginning a process of preparation for an attack against Iran. And the latest news from the Sunday Telegraph, as some of you may know, is that the Israelis may be preparing in the Negev some kind of operation away from America's eyes. So on Iran, it's been within the international consensus through the Security Council. The Afghanistan, I don't need to say very briefly, which came before the Iraq War, the same way. The United States went to the Security Council, has been working through NATO, and today the force in Afghanistan is truly an international force. So even when the neocons were supposedly dominant, the United States was functioning through that international mechanism. The situation on the Palestinian-Israeli track. Well, it's true, the United States has not done a lot on the Palestinian-Israeli track, but I would submit to you that the United States can't do anything on the Palestinian-Israeli track. Now and then, it seems to me, we should understand that the United States does not control all regional dynamics down to their intimate details. The fact of the matter is that the Bush administration has been condemned for not doing enough. But it's absolutely correct that the United States made errors in judgment, to my mind. They did undermine the PLO. They did undermine the PLO by taking positions on the negotiations. As you recall, for example, one of the early decisions, Bush supported the incorporation of Israeli settlements into a future Israeli state, in other words, in the West Bank. The United States did isolate Yasser Arafat, creating a way for Hamas to essentially emerge as the most dominant force. There's no doubt about this. So in terms of efficacy, I would agree with Rami that this was not a success. But I would not blame the United States for the breakdown in the Israeli-Palestinian talks, because quite frankly, I think that the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian talks do not allow for a successful conclusion of negotiations. I don't believe that Hamas is interested in a final peace deal. They say, I actually believe what Hamas says. And I don't think that the Israeli political system is a system that today is structured in a way to arrive at a compromise on giving up occupied land. They were able to do this under Ariel Sharon in Gaza. I think it's a much more complicated situation in the West Bank. And frankly, we see the result. And I think we will continue to have this cycle. Whenever substantial amounts of land are going to give up, coalition governments break down, you have a new election, and suddenly the system reaches a new type of status quo where nothing can be achieved. I think these are structural problems on both the Palestinian and Israeli sides that no matter how much time the US spends for a breakthrough in the Palestinian-Israeli talks, it will not succeed. I understand American lethargy here. In Lebanon, again, I don't think I need to repeat what Rami said. I think Lebanon is one of the successes of the Bush administration. And once again, since we're talking about unilateral neocons, the United States once again functioned through the United Nations Security Council to pass Resolution 1559, to pass the investigation of Hariri's assassination, and later to create this mixed Lebanese international tribunal. Of course, there are those who condemn the United States for its acts in 2006 during the Summer War, how the US, in a way, tried to delay as long as possible an end to the conflict. That's perfectly reasonable. But I would remind you, of course, that that was not outside the international and regional consensus. The fact is that most of the Arab states, and even in the international community, were more or less in agreement with that policy. It was bloody, but that's the reality. Let's be serious. That was the reality, and you will remember very well, those of you who remember what happened, the movement on the Arab front and even on the international front to essentially support the American position. I think I will just conclude then with a statement by saying, at this point, what is required in looking at the Bush administration, I think, is a cold eye. If only because we need to judge the Obama administration with a cold eye as well. In other words, I think too much of the attitude to the condemnation of the Bush administration has been based, has in a way transformed itself into support for an Obama administration. My fear and my feeling, and we'll discuss this when we discuss Obama, is that you're going to have a lot of the same with an Obama administration, very simply because Barack Obama will be facing the same constraints that Bush faced. There will be good, there will be bad. And by and large, we'll have to judge, and I agree with Rami on one thing. I approve of what he has judged Bush on the basis of results. I think that's the only way you can judge George W. Bush. Maybe I would disagree with him on certain outcomes that he sees. I don't think that regional chaos is really the fault of George W. Bush, and I think that terrorist groups, as we all know, existed before 9/11. They're the ones, after all, who created 9/11. If anything, I blame the Clinton administration for having not read the Al-Qaeda phenomenon properly. But again, I think that's best left to the discussion between them. Thank you.
Well, our speakers went on a little too long.
We get paid by the word.
Paid by the word. But nevertheless, maybe we should give them a minute or two if they want to ask each other questions or make any reactions to what they've just heard.
Thank you. I just want to make one thing clear where I said the removal of Saddam Hussein was a good thing. In retrospect, I'm trying to look at what the U.S. did and what did it do that could possibly be seen as something positive. And the removal of Saddam Hussein is a positive thing in the abstract, or it actually in reality, but I was against it. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I was for it from the beginning. I wasn't. I think the U.S. was completely morally and politically without any justification or legitimacy in doing what it did in Iraq. But in retrospect, I mean, it happened, and so from all of the damage that the U.S. has done, and others in the region, I think, looking back, that is one positive element. This terrible guy and the regime that he ran is no longer there. But the cost was so high and the ramifications were so severe that the totality of the enterprise was foolhardy and extremely negative. I don't agree with Michael about the Iraq being the exceptional case to U.S. multilateralism. I think U.S. multilateralism has broadly been insincere and expedient. The U.S. Went to the international community when it felt it needed to get cover. If it didn't get the cover, it forgot about the international community, did what it wanted to. The best example of multilateralism was the Security Council and the Hariri Tribunal, because there was global agreement about the crime of killing Hariri, whoever did it, and there needed to be an investigation to bring this sort of impunity to an end. And I'm all for the international tribunal, and whoever it targets and whoever they bring into indictments against is a good thing. I think the problem, broadly speaking, in the U.S., and I disagree again here, I don't think Bush administration was typical of American foreign policy in the Middle East. It was very atypical because of the circumstances of 9/11 predominantly. If you remember Bush at the beginning of his administration, he was not interventionist, he didn't want to do nation building, he stayed away from Arab-Israeli stuff. 9/11 forced him to react to this crime. And what came about was a convergence in the White House of a series of forces and interests and worldviews, which is unprecedented in its capacity to inaccurately read the realities of the world. Neocons, traditional conservative Republican types, Christian fundamentalist extremists, pro-Israeli groups, anti-Islamic groups, that the fomenting of anti-Islamism after 9/11, all of these groups came together in an administration in which the leader, the president, had neither the knowledge nor the interest in foreign policy to really bring these people together into a coherent force. And they misdiagnosed the problem. They came up with a strategy, the war on terror and other things, that compounded the underlying initial problem. And I think it was an unusual foreign policy. It was an overreaction to the terror problem, which was a criminal problem. By the way, there's a third, I said there's two things. I think there's a third thing you can look at in the Bush administration that can be seen maybe as positive from the American perspective, which is they haven't had another attack on American soil, which from the American perspective is probably a success story. So I think we've had more problems have been created by the Bush foreign policy than problems have been solved. One of them is a colossal misreading of the Islamist phenomenon, of Islamism. People who speak and act in the language of Islam. There's been a tremendous confusion between nationalism, resistance to occupation, religious identity, and the democratic, autocratic, and the secular religious divides. The Bush White House, with its convergence of different groups, has completely mangled any kind of coherent capacity to disentangle, disaggregate these issues, and to see what is nationalism, to see what is resistance to foreign occupation, to see what is a natural turn to religious identity among people who are either occupied by a foreign occupier or subjugated by their own dictatorial regimes or mistreated by a global or regional economic and social order. So I think the inability of the administration after 9/11 to sort these things out was an unusual failure. Americans are smarter than what we saw in the Bush foreign policies. Fundamental American decency and intelligences and smart people was put aside in the Bush White House in terms of foreign policy. And the last point I would make is, I think the area that I think is most tragic in the Bush White House and foreign policy in the Middle East was the democracy and freedom policy, which I support 100%. I mean, the Bush's second inaugural address was a ringing statement, which nobody in the world could possibly oppose. It was a powerful, passionate, really captivating expression of the fundamental quest for freedom by individual human beings and the connection between freedom and democracy and prosperity and social order and a safe world. It was extremely moving and very powerful. The problem is that almost every single policy that the Bush administration pursued in the Middle East contradicted the rhetoric of that inaugural address. And this is the basic problem that we've had in the Bush administration, a selective pursuit of democracy and freedom and fighting terror and extremism. So I don't want to, out of courtesy, because we're at AUB, I don't want to go naming other Arab regimes by name, but the inconsistency of promoting democracy across the region was staggering in the Bush White House. And in the end, it was a death knell of American credibility, and this is the problem we have. So it's a very important, and I agree with Michael, we need to analyze this history. It's very important history because the Bush administration was so unusual. What they did, Carter to an extent talked a little bit about human rights back in the 70s, but Bush was a qualitative leap forward in the desire to intervene within these societies and change them. He was well motivated, but the policies were badly planned. They were based on miscalculations and misunderstanding and some ignorance. They were driven by extreme, violent, extremist, frenzied, zealot-like ideological maniacs in the White House and around the White House who came together in a kind of a hooligan-type collection of wild people who just wanted to go around beating up people, and this was masquerading as U.S. foreign policy. It was terrible. But it happened. It was a reality. And I think we need to unravel it to understand what were the driving forces, what was the problem within American policymaking, what were the problems here in the Middle East, and who, by the way, was complicit. Because, and I want to repeat again, we don't blame the Bush administration for all of our problems here. We blame ourselves first and foremost. We blame the Israelis. We blame some historical legacies. But current policies are driven heavily by American dominance. And this is a problem that has to be disaggregated and studied very carefully so that we don't repeat these problems over and over.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. I'll be very brief. There's a lot there that Rami picked up on, and I'm not going to respond to, I'm just going to respond to just 2 or 3 points. I find there's a certain contradiction in what you just said, Rami. I mean, on the one hand, you were saying the United States was intervening in these societies, wanted to change these societies. On the other, the first thing you said is that they allowed these regimes, these dictatorial regimes, to continue. And that's indeed true. The second inaugural address, the problem with it is that, in fact, Bush never implemented that particular policy. He did implement it, sincerely or not, let's say insincerely, but he did implement it in Iraq by removing a mass murder from power. And what did Arab liberals do? They condemned it. Instead of saying, this is an opportunity for us as Arabs you know, we're not supporting the United States, but we managed to get rid of a tyrant. Let us now take advantage of this for our own ends. What did many Arab liberals do? They condemned the messenger. They said, this is the United States that did this, so we have to oppose this. You yourself, earlier, you said you thought it was a good thing, but at the same time, you said, but I opposed it. I don't understand that logic. How can something be a good thing, and at the same time, you oppose it? The removal of Saddam Hussein was, in and of itself, a good thing. Did the United States disastrously plan the post-war period? Absolutely. No one is suggesting that the United States is really, you know, to be quite honest, I find the debate on the United States tiresome. The debate that interests me is, as someone living in the Arab world, someone who is half Arab, how I could take advantage of American policy in the Middle East after 2003. I'm not interested really in Bush and what people think about Bush. The problem with Iraq, in the United States as in the Middle East, is that it was always about Bush. Bush wasn't the problem. The question was, Arab society able to take advantage of the removal of this man, named Saddam Hussein, and build on it? And the fact is, the unfortunate fact is, that the Arab world was unable to. Arab liberals failed. Okay? It was Bush, it's always Bush, it will continue to be Bush, and now that Obama is here, everyone loves Obama because they hate Bush. I find that a very, very, I'm sorry to say, a very poor way of approaching a very interesting subject. These were not ideologues. These were people who had served in other Bush administrations. They were hard-line, that's true. But, you know, they were hard-line in the same way that, you know, you can be hard-line in other countries. These were not people, these were not necessarily Christian fundamentalists. The real thing that needs to be studied in the United States, I think, is why did this administration, why did Condi Rice, who never gave a damn about democracy in the Middle East, because of course she was close to Brent Scowcroft, who never gave a damn about democracy in the Middle East. Why did Condi Rice suddenly start speaking about democracy in the Middle East? The reason is, I think, that basically Condi Rice figured, Bush is speaking about it, I better speak about it or I'll be marginalized in this administration. And that's what happened. I think a lot of people were, and here I agree with Rami, there was never real strong guidance on the part of Bush. He never had a clear center of gravity to say, this is what I want. He created big gaps, and suddenly these big gaps, all these people in the administration, for bureaucratic reasons, because they didn't want to be marginalized, basically figured, well, where's the president? I'm going to be with the president. Maybe with an exception, Cheney had a better sense of where he wanted to go. But of course, Cheney is the Darth Vader of the administration, so no one wants to follow him. But these were not nutty ideologues, and I insist on that. Third point, and Rami, this is addressed to you. There is a certain, I think, I'm puzzled by something in your approach. You take actually what is in your talk, you took a realist approach in your analysis of the United States by saying basically the United States is no longer feared. It's not loved and it's not feared. Of course, the famous phrase of Machiavelli. Now, this is a very realist approach to policy. In other words, in a way, what Rami is implicitly saying is that if the United States is feared, and it will be more respected. Fine. Let's follow that logic. But if that's what you're saying, then what you're effectively saying, Rami, is that the United States should not pursue, in a way, the United States should not pursue ideals or some kind of moral ideal. It should pursue, in a very bare way, its national interests. Do you, from what I heard you saying, are you really someone advocating the United States should pursue its national interests as opposed to pursuing, for example, some kind of moral ideal in the region? And if so, why do you complain when you say the United States did not back these UN Security Council, was not sincere in backing these various UN Security Council decisions? What you seem to be saying is that only sincerity should be the judge of American intentions. On the other hand, you're turning around and saying, actually, we shouldn't forget about American sincerity. What we should do is the United States should be judged solely on the basis of whether it has successfully pursued its policy. You cannot, I think, in a way, align, on the one hand, a very realist reading of how America should behave in the Middle East, as you've done, and at the same time condemn the United States on moral grounds. It's one or the other. If we adopt a realist approach to American policy in the region, then, quite honestly, whether they like the Palestinians or help the Palestinians, whether they bomb Iran or don't bomb Iran, all that's irrelevant on moral grounds. We should only be judged on the basis of whether it's efficient. Okay? So I'm a bit lost. Are you suggesting the US should pursue a realist foreign policy, an amoral realist foreign policy? Or on the contrary, should the United States pursue a foreign policy based on justice and essentially moral right?
Well, I think what the United States should do is what every power should do, and every government should do, which is pursue a combination of self-interest based on legitimacy. And if it is taking its army around the world, it should also then pursue those goals of self-interest and legitimacy on the basis of consistency. I mean, I have no problem in an abstract way with the United States going around and changing every regime in the world that's a dictatorial regime, and giving every country in the world the power to elect its own people and form its own government. In the abstract, I have no problem with that. But when it's done selectively, I have a problem. Consistency, to me, in this respect, matters a lot. The U.S. should, the great tragedy of Bush foreign policy, and certainly other people before, I agree with a lot of your points that there isn't, that the only exceptional thing about Bush foreign policy is the 9/11 reaction, the post-9/11 policy and the convergence of these different groups and the distortions that came about. But what is really tragic about the Bush foreign policy is that it passed up the opportunity to bring together American values and the exceptionalism that the United States represents of real equality, pluralism, etc., to bring together that value system that defines it at home with the conduct of its foreign policy. If those two can be brought together, you have an unstoppable force that everybody in the world will want to embrace and be a part of. But they didn't. They talked about democracy and freedom, and they used unilateral militarism, torture, all kinds of supporting dictators. The contradictions between the rhetoric and the practice, between the values that they spoke of at home and the foreign policy principles they implemented was so great, that gap was so great, that it collapsed any potential success of the United States into a heap of failure. So I think I want the U.S. to be involved in the Middle East. I think personally, as somebody who is an American citizen as well as a Jordanian citizen and a Palestinian national and a Pan-Arab and a Levantine and the last Pan-Arab nationalist and the first Levantine citizen, I think I want the U.S. to be more involved in this region. I think fundamental American values are good. I think the fundamental desires of Americans for their government abroad is to do well, to do no harm. To protect American interests, absolutely, first and foremost. That's what any foreign policy does. You protect your personal, your national interests. But if you can do that by also projecting good values and working with others to promote these in a way that is defined by everybody together, then I think we have a win-win situation. We'll get into that maybe in terms of the next, what we want the Obama administration to do. But the difference with the United States is that it is sending 150,000 soldiers here and in Afghanistan, and it is supporting mukhabarat states all over the region. It is doing nothing when Democrats get jailed. And it is giving Israel's letters of assurances that it can do whatever it wants in terms of settlements and refugees, etc. The United States is acting in the Middle East on the ground in a way that is so contrary to what it is talking about, that it brings about this problem that we have. So we have. I think there's no problem with criticizing the U.S. because the U.S. is doing what it's doing in the Middle East. I don't criticize the Belgians because they're not doing what the United States is doing in the Middle East. But the U.S. is here with its army, with its pro-Israeli bias, with its anti-democratic tendencies, and so it is a huge factor in the problems and the distortions and the violence and the volatility of this region. But I repeat, it's not the only factor. And most of these problems were here. What Bush administration did is exacerbate them rather than create them. And it's up to us in the region to figure out how do we not repeat this and how do we do a better job in the future.
Perhaps we better go to the Obama administration. And I guess we're going to have to be a little bit quicker about this. To what extent are we going to have a fundamental difference in Middle East policies? I mean, are we going to have the war on terror as the centerpiece? Are we going to have the Bush doctrine continuing? Michael.
Thank you, Patrick. When I thought we had an Obama administration, it was called the Clinton administration. I think I'll be much briefer here because I think that a lot of what I will say about the Obama administration was already said in a way in the context of the discussion of Bush. I think, quite frankly, that there will be very little room for Obama to maneuver, largely because, as I said, I think by and large the Bush administration did function within the context of an international consensus on most of the issues of the Middle East, from Iran to Palestine to Afghanistan, even to Lebanon. I don't really see that there's much room for radical change on the part of the Obama administration. Now, let's talk politics a little bit. Today, what are Obama's priorities? What will his first priority be? Obviously, his priority will be the financial crisis, I think, when the administration takes office. Now, new administrations don't like to make mistakes. They like to show that they can be effective, and they like to raise confidence in their capacity to succeed. The Middle East is a place where very few people tend to succeed. It's a graveyard of success. And this is why I think that maybe that in and of itself should be one reason why people should temper a little bit their expectations about what the Obama administration will do early on. That doesn't mean they won't do anything, but I think that we should just keep that in mind. On Iraq, let's start with Iraq. There's been, as you know, a military agreement was reached, a security agreement between the Bush administration and the Iraqi government last week, I think. To a certain extent, or 2 weeks ago, to a certain extent, I think this will remove a lot of pressure on Obama, who, as you know, in his campaign had set a rather rigid timeline for withdrawal. I think that the security agreement buys him a certain margin of maneuver. I don't think that he will fundamentally alter that agreement. So on Iraq, I see policy continuing more or less within the confines of what we've seen. There may be some changes here and there, but let's not forget the people who are in charge in Iraq and will be in charge at U.S. Central Command are the same people who were there under Bush. And I'm talking, of course, about Petraeus at Central Command and what's the name of the general in Iraq? Odierno, that's right, sorry. As I gave you that quote from an Obama person last week who said Iraq is yesterday's war. That's the perception in his camp. In Afghanistan, we may indeed have a change. And here, let's remember that Obama in Afghanistan has basically been as hardline as Bush has been on Afghanistan. Indeed, Petraeus has gone to Central Command. He will be, one of his priorities will be Afghanistan. Obama in the campaign said that the United States is fighting the wrong war in Iraq. They should be fighting the war in Afghanistan against terrorism. My suspicion is there we may see some change. We may see an escalation of the U.S. role. But let's not expect in any way that Obama will be more of a dove when it comes to a war like Afghanistan. On the contrary, I think all the ingredients are there for an escalation. Let's bear in mind, however, that war is not necessarily the only outcome. As you know, the Saudis have been mediating with the Taliban, and I think there is room there because no one really wants a war like the previous Afghan war between the Soviet Union. There is room for the Saudis to play and to, in a sense, make themselves quite valuable in Washington. So that's something to watch out for, the Saudi role. On Iran, well, everyone says Obama should open a dialogue with Iran. I would recommend you read Rami's piece tomorrow in the Daily Star. He's written precisely on this subject, on how you should engage Iran. I think that the engagement of Iran in and of itself is not a bad idea. The question, of course, is how do you engage Iran? The big question for Obama, I think, as he looks ahead in the coming months, will be the following. It's what strengths does the United States have to engage Iran? What cards does the U.S. have? If Obama feels that a negotiation or an opening to Iran is not going to lead to the desired results, I think that he will shy away from this in the early months of his administration. He doesn't want to be taken to the cleaners by the Iranians. Let me remind you that a year ago, Condoleezza Rice wanted to open a U.S. interest section in Tehran, similar to the Iranian interest section in the United States. This was her objective. She was going around saying this. She has not been able to do so. I mean, there are dynamics to the U.S.-Iranian relationship that prevent progress in certain fields. And it's not all the Americans' fault on this front. So on Iran, I don't think Obama will want to take risks unless he's guaranteed of the results. So that's something that may, in a way, make more difficult the breakthrough. On Syria, well, the Syrians have a lot riding on Obama, but they feel that this will be a change with Bush. But there are two things that the Syrians will have a problem with, I think, with an Obama administration. First of all, they will have to convince Obama that their process, their peace negotiations with Israel, that the Syrians are more interested in that to achieve results, that they actually want results from that negotiation with Israel, not that they simply want a process. They want to be caught up in a process which, in effect, will open the door of Damascus, will allow Damascus to open a new relationship with Washington. Sorry, that was a garbled sentence. Essentially, the Americans want to be sure that the Syrians are sincere about a peace negotiation with Israel. Again, that doesn't mean that they will not send an ambassador back to Damascus, but the fact is, Syria will have to convince the Americans that they're sincere. Second thing, let's not forget, there is a parliamentary election in Israel in February. And all the signs are that if Netanyahu doesn't win, it doesn't win, but he will be part of a coalition government with Kadima. And I think that will substantially make more difficult the negotiation with Syria on the Golan Heights. So even there, I think nothing happens before February, March, when a new Israeli government is in place at the earliest. And the fact is, once again, Obama will not want to enter into an engagement unless he's fairly sure that the results will be positive. He doesn't want to be taken to the cleaners by the Syrians in the same way that great statesman, Colin Powell, was taken to the cleaners by Bashar al-Assad in 2001. Finally, the Palestinian track, and then Lebanon, and then I think I have like 2 minutes. On the Palestinian track, once again, as I said earlier, the dynamics I don't think allow a breakthrough today. They will be even worse, I think, after an Israeli election. If Netanyahu is in an Israeli government, and all the signs are that he is, that will make much more difficult a negotiating process with the Palestinians. I think at the same time that we're going to be entering into a very difficult period between Abbas and Hamas because Abbas's presidential term comes up in January. On the Palestinian front, you're probably going to have disarray. I don't see that dynamically that's going to create a breakthrough on the Palestinian front. No matter who is Secretary of State, no matter who is a Middle East envoy, the fact of the matter is that structurally this is a very difficult nut to crack. So I'm not very optimistic. And finally, on Lebanon, I think that Lebanon is a blip on the American map these days. But in a way, what that means is that at least in terms of rhetoric, the policy will not change very much. Now, how does that play out in terms of the dynamic relationship with Syria? I don't know. I don't believe that the US is going to subcontract once again Lebanon to Syria, unless we end up subcontracting ourselves to Syria. But the fact is that Syria has to be careful. To a certain extent, in Washington, as in Paris, as in most places, we're already 3 years beyond the Syrian departure. Syria continues to be manipulating Lebanese affairs. They have imposed a security coordination, which to my mind is very dangerous. But the reality is that, to a certain extent, no administration can allow the sensation to be created that somehow Hezbollah has inherited Lebanon. Or that Syria has inherited Lebanon and therefore Hezbollah has inherited Lebanon. This is going to be difficult for the Syrians to maneuver as they try to reimpose a certain measure of hegemony. And if they overreach, that may actually attract the American attention. Maybe that's an optimistic reading. But by and large, I think, to conclude, all I'm really trying to say is I don't really see on all these levels major breakthroughs, except perhaps in Afghanistan. And even then, the tendency may be for the administration to avoid a conflict by trying to see ways in which the Saudis can play a more positive role. But by and large, I don't see that the Middle East will be as much of a revolution as many people are hoping for. Thank you.
I think the Obama administration is confronting a world and a Middle East that are very different than anything any American administration has confronted before. The world, obviously, because of the global financial crisis, and presumably that will be resolved in the coming year and it will slowly go back to some normalcy. But the Middle East is structurally and fundamentally different than it ever was before. Because of what I described before, I think we've had, because of the trends within the Arab world and Iran and Turkey and other places in the region, internal trends in the last 40, 50 years, combined with the Arab-Israeli conflicts ramifications, combined with these foreign armies that keep coming at us every 10 or 20 years, the combination of those things has generated a whole new mindset in the Arab world, which I would argue is functionally equivalent, morally, temperamentally, morally, and functionally, politically equivalent to the civil rights movement in the United States. What I mean by that is the civil, and leading to the election of Obama now, a black American president, you have something similar going on, I think, all over the Middle East. It started in the 70s, and it has gone through different manifestations, but what it reflects is large numbers of people, several 100 million people, no longer willing to simply accept and acquiesce in their own marginalization, subjugation, occupation, or vulnerabilities and fragilities and poverty and pauperization. Large numbers, hundreds of millions of people are affirming their identity, demanding their rights, mobilizing and working for taking care of their kids in a better shape. Whether they do it through Islamist movements, tribal movements, criminal gangs, globalization, different ways, militias, there's all kinds of different ways that people do this. The Islamist movements are the single biggest manifestation of a massive regional reassertion of not only one's rights, but one's very humanity. And I think this is something that you see all over the place in many different forms. And it leads to the situation that we have now with this broad division of the entire Middle East. If you take Turkey and Iran and the Arab world and Israel, you have two evenly matched groups. They're quite evenly matched. One close to Syria and Iran and Hezbollah and the others, and one close to the US and Israel and some Arab governments. And they've fought each other in many different ways. They fought to a stalemate, I think. Neither side has won. You see it in the Lebanese government, you see it in the Palestinian government that will be a unity government again one day soon, and I think sooner than people expect. They realize that they're evenly matched. Both sides are legitimate, both sides are powerful, and both sides are prepared to fight to the death. This is a classic stalemate, and these are not stupid people. We have some stupid leaders in the region, but most people are not stupid. Most people are smart. They realize that fighting forever is not a sensible policy, and that's why I think you're seeing signs of, within the region, people accommodating to one another, forming unity governments, forming coalitions, calling truces, exchanging prisoners, mediating conflicts. You have little signs of this all over the place. It represents, I think, and you see this reflected in the policy of the Bush administration in the last year and a half, where it did take a more relaxed view, for instance, to the Iranians. And even to Hezbollah to an extent, where 3-4 years ago the U.S. was saying, we've got to disarm them, and then it said, well, this is for the Lebanese to solve, they've got to do it. And with Iran, the same thing. The U.S. has been patient, has worked with the Europeans and IAEA. You have a more realistic, I think, attitude by the U.S., by people in the region, looking for, is there a way to resolve these conflicts peacefully rather than by continued warfare or confrontation? And the two biggest elements in this regional confrontation and tension are the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Iran situation. And I think the Obama administration comes into power in this context of, and also seeing that the continuation of the Iran tension and the Arab-Israeli conflict combined are the two biggest destabilizing, radicalizing forces in the region. Arab-Israeli has been for 60 years, the Iran situation only for about 20 years, 30 years or so. But there is a potential to look at the region as a whole and say, well, maybe if we are smart and sort of key and rational and accurate and decent in our engagement with people and law-abiding, that we, the people of the region and the foreign powers who are engaged, can perhaps work out a better way to resolve these problems, as they did in South Africa and Northern Ireland and other places. There's no reason why we can't do the same. So I think there's a huge potential opportunity here. It requires strong American leadership. It requires, because the Americans are the only people the Israelis will have confidence in, it requires a much more rational, activist European engagement. It requires a role by the Russians and the Chinese as well to be more active. But I think that we have potential huge changes that may come about. And it requires looking at Iran and looking at Arab-Israeli issues as the two poles, and then other things revolve around that. Syria, for instance, the Syrian-Lebanese relationship, the situation in Somalia, the situation in Iraq, Afghanistan. All of these are important elements, but they all come together in what is now a very regional dynamic. I agree with Michael. I don't think you're going to see many significant dramatic changes to begin with, but I think what we should look for are signs of a change in tone rather than a significant change in policy. The change in policy has already happened on Iraq and on Iran. The Bush administration has made significant changes on Iraq and Iran in the last year. Low-key, not dramatic, but significant changes to go slowly with Iran and work multilaterally. The Iranians have won the battle, the ideological battle with the West. They've defied the sanctions. They've stood their ground. They've done a complete fuel cycle. They're enhancing their ability to enrich uranium. They have not given in to the threats and the sanctions, and they're going ahead with what they feel is their right to have a full uranium enrichment fuel cycle. So they've achieved their goals. They are now, I think, in a situation where they're prepared to make a deal, because they not only have they feel that they've won, but they feel also that their allies have done pretty well around the region as well. So I think the Iranians are prepared for a deal, because they will continue to suffer, especially with $50 a barrel oil. The situation is ripe in Palestine. I think I disagree with Michael. I think there is a potential for a huge breakthrough on the Arab-Israeli conflict if there can be significant movement on the single biggest issue that remains, which is the refugee issue. Because all other aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict are solvable, and we know how they can be resolved, except on the refugee issue. The sudden love affair with the Arab peace plan that we're hearing from some Israelis, and you're hearing echoes of it from the Obama people, I'm told. This is a very important sign that people are searching for a different way to do things. So I think there will be a change in tone. There will be a change in people will study this issue. I think Obama is a much more cerebral person than Bush. I think the people around him are much more seasoned, and I disagree with Michael a bit that I think there was a lot of ideological drivers in the Bush administration, inside it or outside it. I think and all of this was driven by the anger at 9/11. I mean, what Bush did was abnormal. The times were abnormal. The emotional reaction was abnormal. He wasn't born abnormal, but he became abnormal with the reaction to 9/11. And it's understandable. But so I think this is a different time. This is a time for much more rational analysis. And you have people on the Arab side who are, I think, much more willing to play ball. I think Hamas is much more willing to go into a negotiating situation led by others in Palestine than we assume that they are. And I think the really, really big thing to look for in the short run, especially for us here in Lebanon, is the indictments in the Hariri court. I think this is going to be a huge turning point. We don't know who did these murders. A lot of people here accuse Syrians. Other people are accused. We'll wait to see who the indictments point the finger at. I think this is a seminal. This could be a seminal historic turning point in the modern Middle East, where the impunity that is used to kill people, to murder people for political purposes, presumably, is brought to an end by a criminal justice system that is internationally sanctioned. Whoever did this, I think, will think twice about ever doing it again, but that will only happen when the indictments come out, the court is held, and people are tried in a fair trial, and if the evidence is strong, they are presumably to be convicted. I think the court is a huge turning point in modern Arab history, and it's interesting that we get simultaneously going on two things now at the good and the bad sides of the modern Arab world, but representing, I think, a natural bookending of our generation. The Somali pirates taking a $200 million Saudi tanker, and most of the Arab world, I think, quietly cheering them on, because they feel that this is a kind of, sort of a payback for the way that ordinary people have been mistreated in the region. And at the other end, the International Lebanese Tribunal, a fantastic assertion of the rule of law and the end of impunity and political assassinations. I think these two symbolic events capture where we are. I'm much more hopeful about the future. And I think it's important to look at how the people all around the world, not so much here, but in Europe, especially around the world, they reacted to Obama, not because his policy is any different. And his policy in Arab-Israeli is the same as Hillary Clinton's. There's nothing even worse, probably, because he was pandering from a, he had to catch up a lot. So, the pro-Israeli pandering he did in 1.5 years was what Hillary did in the last 5 or 6 years. So it was terrible. It was just disgraceful and shameful. But this is how American politics works. So we don't expect any change in the policy, but the tone, I think, is going to be different, and that's what people want. They want an American president and leadership that talks differently, that puts its values in its foreign policy. And I think there are potential changes that could happen in the Middle East, and we should work for them. We shouldn't just sit there and expect the Americans. We in the Arab world need to be engaged. We need to give ideas, work with Americans, send out messages. We'll do some of this here at AUB through our institute, and others we will set up. We've already got some things going. We need to work. We need to get off our backsides and take responsibility for the possibility of changing our own future. We are not passive bystanders and spectators in our future. We are active participants. We have rights. We have capabilities, and we need to marshal those resources in a very effective way.
Well, I'm going to make a suggestion that we don't let them talk to each other at this point, but turn it over to audience comments and questions. And I ask you to please try to be brief, and we can let them incorporate the reactions to what each of them has just said in their responses to these things. Please use the microphone for questions. Colin.
I'm going to comment on it, or ask you to comment on a point which you seem to both agree upon, which is that the removal of Saddam Hussein was a good thing. But I see this as having your cake and eating it too. Out of the frying pan into the fire, how can you separate one action from the result?
I disagree with your question. Not at all. You can say that in 2002, 2003, the removal of Saddam Hussein was a good idea. And at the same time, you can say, well, the American screw-up in the post-war period really killed a good idea. There's nothing contradictory. On the contrary, I'll go further than this. I'll say that it was such a good idea that it would have been nice to see it repeated in other countries, but thanks to Bush's errors in Iran, thanks to the misplanning on the part of the administration, the incompetence, what was a good idea suddenly turned into a very bad idea. I don't agree that that you cannot say that. You can, of course, say that. And I have no problem today saying that Iraq, because of the incompetence of the administration in Iran, that good idea will not be repeated. And indeed, if I may just incorporate something that Rami said, I'm a little bit puzzled when you say that on the one hand, the United States has backed dictatorships in the Middle East. That's absolutely true. What are you suggesting, Rami? Are you suggesting that the United States do more of what it did to Saddam, get rid of Bashar al-Assad, get rid of Hosni Mubarak? You know what? I wouldn't mind, but I don't think that's what you're suggesting. I think that as far as you're concerned, that's the last thing you want to see. And the reality is that in terms of actual policy, let's stop going to the extreme. What can you do in terms of actual policy? Of course, the US cannot be consistent. Consistency is not a part of international relations. You can succeed in one place and try to use that to succeed elsewhere. But if you come and say, well, the US didn't, remove Saddam, but they didn't remove Mubarak, and they didn't remove Gaddafi, and they didn't remove so-and-so, so they're not sincere in what they did in Iraq. Well, that's impossible as an argument to refute. If you're trying to tell me they're hypocrites in the Bush administration, of course. The whole point from the beginning of this talk is I'm not interested in their sincerity. I'm interested in what we in the Middle East, how we could have exploited what they did, the removal of Saddam. Hence, coming back to your question.
I would just add, again, I don't want to be misunderstood. I think the U.S. should not have gone to war, should not have removed Saddam militarily. But it happened. I'm just trying to look back. And, it's like when you have a hailstorm and it destroys the orange trees. But then you look back a year later and say, well, what good happened in that hailstorm? Well, it destroyed the orange trees, but it provided a lot of water, and roses came up in the spring from the water that came down with the hailstorm. So in this totality of
the same roses they were supposed to throw at the American troops.
That's right.
No, but actually, what you're saying is you're contradicting your own argument.
No, I'm saying that in 2003, I was against the war in Iraq. I think the U.S. should not have gone in and removed the dictator unilaterally as it did. Removing any dictator in the abstract is a good thing, of course. But in the option, the alternative to the U.S. doing what it did was, I think, to craft, and this responds to your question, Michael, that what do you do in this situation? I think it's not an easy situation because you're dealing with the cumulative consequences of 50, 60 years. As Bush himself said, the U.S. supported security and at the expense of liberty. What do you do? Well, you've got this accumulation of people's sentiments and mistreatment and abuse, etc., etc. And so you have now Islamist movements and militias and terror groups and all tribal groups, and the central state is getting weaker here and there. So a transition by nature is going to be messy. But it was messy in the Soviet Union. You've got to go through it at some point. So what I would tell the U.S. to do, and I think consistency matters an awful lot, because it is written into the American credo of the universality of human rights and not only that liberty was a right to all people, but it's divinely given right to all people. I think the United States takes that position seriously, and I adhere to it. What the U.S. should do in a situation like this should say, look, we, the United States, support certain values: the consent of the governed, independent judiciary, equality as much as it can be given an opportunity to all people, the rule of law, basic fundamental values that everybody here certainly agrees with. And the U.S. should say, we will support people who adhere to these values, and we will not support people who don't support these values. The U.S. is not going to withdraw its military aid to Egypt or Saudi Arabia tomorrow, I know that. But what the U.S. can do is lay out a set of principles and say that these principles will drive its policy. And let this over time, and look at what happened in the Soviet Union. It took a while, but the people of the region here must change their autocratic regimes. It can't be done by foreign armies. It can't be done by foreign threats. But there is a role for foreign countries to help this process along, but only by respecting the dignity and the legitimacy of the people themselves in this region. So I know it sounds kind of contradictory. So I want the U.S. and all Western powers to support this, but to do it in a way that is effective.
Can I just get one sentence in? And then, but if the United States starts doing that, Rami, telling people what they should do, you're going to hear screams of neo-imperialism again, because that's precisely how the region reacts. When the U.S. starts giving people advice and telling them how they should function, everyone says, well, look, the U.S. is bossing, is telling us what to do. Really, you're caught in a catch-22.
No, I don't think so at all. What the U.S. should say is, here are the principles that we, the U.S., support around the world, not telling the Tunisians or the Egyptians or the Saudis what to do, saying these are principles that we, the U.S., will support all over the world, and Asia and Africa, everywhere. And by its actions, when the aid comes up to foreign aid to Egypt or military aid to Tunisia, maybe they'll say, well, we'll reduce it 10% this year, or we won't increase it, leave it like it is. Inflation will bring it down 10%, but we're going to support this country because they did this or that. They react to the actions of people in this region, and if people act in a way that the U.S. feels it can support morally and politically, then it helps those people. And that's what an alliance of like-minded democracies or freedom-loving people can be. I think it's doable, but the transition is going to be messy because in the interim you're going to have Islamist governments, you're going to have tribal governments, and you're going to have pirate governments. And this is a process that we have to get through this stage.
If the assumption, I mean, I'm saying this because you both said it, that these dictators, there's a whole garden variety of them, Saddam Hussein to Noriega, if you want. At some point, they were U.S. allies propped up militarily, and then, for some reason or the other, they were removed from power. So, if they're getting wrong every time in a continuum of policy making that is a failure, if I may say, and I'm going to say now is probably not very popular. I myself don't believe it, but I'm curious to know what you think. Assuming that the Obama administration is not going to be able to create this huge paradigm shift in the region, don't you think that actually somebody is making a paradigm shift? And this might be Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah making a paradigm shift in the region. The U.S. is being reactionary, and shouldn't this panel be discussing the Ahmadinejad administration and the next administration in Iran? Thank you.
I think that's more or less what I was saying, that people in this region have taken an initiative, many people, not everybody, and you have a stalemate. The Ahmadinejad, it's Khamenei more than Ahmadinejad, but you have these two groups, and they're reacting to each other, but I think because they've fought each other to a stalemate, I think they're both ripe for looking at a better way to solve these problems.
Sorry, when you say get it wrong, on what basis are you making, or are we making such a judgment? If it's on a realist basis, on the basis of a realist approach to foreign policy, the realists, as you know, basically in their approach are amoral. Not immoral, they may be immoral, but they're amoral. In other words, they don't have a great problem dealing with dictatorships. So a realist may look at 40, 50 years of American performance in the Middle East after World War II and say, by and large, it's been successful. Okay, there are dictatorships, but there has been stability up to X time. We have a great deal with the Saudis where we get low-priced oil in exchange for providing security to the Gulf, and so forth and so on. Now, that's a realist approach. If you take a more value-based approach, a more human rights-based approach, and here I think maybe Rami and I are a little bit more on the same wavelength, then you say, well, wait a minute, what the realists did is they essentially managed chaos through these relationships, but they created a situation in the Middle East over 50 years where if a dictatorship can be ever more corrupt, it's in the Middle East. It's where, 30 years ago you had a dictatorship or 40, but they didn't hand off to their sons. Today they are so corrupt, so, in a way, idealist, without ideas, that today the dictator has nowhere to go to except to hand off to his son, whether it's Bashar in Syria, whether it's Jamal in Egypt, whether it's, whatever his name, Saif al-Islam in Libya. And there you would say, wait a minute, the realists are wrong. The fact is that the Middle East is getting worse and worse and worse, which is indeed, as Rami said correctly, I think, has given much more legitimacy to Islamist groups, including jihadist, violent jihadist groups, which is precisely why I believe you can explain, that's how you can explain 9/11. I'm sorry, I don't see 9/11 as being America's comeuppance It was really because the United States, indeed, allowed these dictatorial regimes in the region to, in a way, to create such a lack of legitimacy that these Islamists came up, and they hit out against the United States. And that's why for me personally, and please feel free to disagree, when Bush said, wait a minute, the problem, maybe he was a hypocrite. Again, I don't care. But hypocritically, he said, let's try, or some of the neocons said, let's try to change the regime and make a democracy in Iraq. It may make a fundamental difference in the Middle East. It may affect Saudi Arabia in positive ways. I agreed with this. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I was wrong. Certainly the planning of the Bush administration didn't show that they were very serious in this. But the fact of the matter is, we're going back now with Obama, and already we've gone back with Bush, to the old policies that have been followed for the last half century. The dictators will remain dictators. When Gamal becomes president, the Americans will recognize him the same way they did when Bashar became president. And quite frankly, I think that while Bush, there has been a deep need for a fundamental change in American outlook to the Middle East. And should it be more value-based? I agree with Rami on this, except I'm willing to go further than Rami. I'm willing to say, let's get rid of regimes if that's what it takes. If that's what it takes. Does this mean a blank check to start war everywhere? Of course not. Of course not. That will fail. But if at the end of the day, you can use force, you can use economic sanctions, you can use other levers, alliances with certain more open Arab societies, you can use soft power. There are many ways that can be used to alter systems in the region. It may not work all the way, but you have to accept that the policy of the last half century, to which we're going back today, by the way, with Obama, is a policy that basically, I find, bankrupt. The realist approach to the Middle East is bankrupt.
Dr. Holoff?
It's getting too late and the audience is thinning, and I have full admiration of my friends, both Rami and Michael. I was, precisely because Rami was saying you're cosmopolitan, you're Levantine, you're Palestinian, you're American, whatever, I was expecting a bit more from both of you. And it's only at the end you have really began to address the issues which I think are of concern to many of us. Will there be, like the colleague there, I was going to ask a question that he asked, will there be a paradigm shift in American foreign policy towards soft power, towards soft diplomacy, the role that the Americans played so admirably in the 19th century until the Woodrow Wilson era? Unless we begin to do that, we are caught in precisely what Rami, you've been saying. We are caught in saying, will this policy going to be changed? Are we going to be trapped within this? I really invite this audience to read two very unusual documents. One, Michel Chihab, the Francophone journalist, wrote between 1946 until 1956, just before he died, weekly editorials in L'Orient Le Jour about Palestine. These have just been translated into English. What he says in those editorials is exactly plus ça change, plus ça la même chose. What essentially he's saying, America not only was caught by the Zionist lobby, but they became agents to persuade other reluctant states in the area to support the creation of the Zionist regime. He was also saying, partly it's the stupidity of the Arabs. You know, given those three things, the Balfour Declaration, the White House becoming simply an agent for Israel, and the stupidity of the Arabs, where do we go? We can only go if... the second document you ought to read is a letter I just received, written by, of all people, Ralph Nader, a personal letter to Obama, a 4-page letter, which I never thought, Michael, that our friend could have that much, courage to tell Obama 6 times, shame on you, Obama. Shame on you, Obama. He takes him on things he had promised under the rubric of hopes and change, and he's essentially saying right now that Obama has put himself as being in the fold of AIPAC.
More or less a comment?
Just one quick one. I think it's important to separate domestic politics from foreign policy as much as we can. In the situation of the Arab-Israeli conflict and U.S. politics, there is no separation because the pro-Israeli groups have a complete hold on the system, and it's very clear, and we all know how it works, and there's no doubt about it. But I think at the level of domestic politics, politicians behave in an abnormal way, especially in an election year. They say all kinds of things, and people have a lot of hope, and we see this extraordinary moment in American life now with Obama and these tremendous expectations, partly a reaction to the problems people have suffered, especially the economic stress, but also Americans basically they understand that they no longer are widely respected around the world as a state in terms of their policy, while their basic values are deeply respected, and people want to keep going to the U.S. So I think the Nader comments about Obama are interesting. I haven't read it yet, but I will. But the reality is that Nader is marginalized right now in American politics. But he speaks the truth, but the political system doesn't work on the basis of truth. It works on the basis of emotions, and it works on the basis of power. We haven't figured out how to tap into that. The Israelis have. And this is why we have these deep problems.
I think you were,
yeah. I mean, I agree mainly with Michael on the assessment of Bush's administration, how different it is from other administrations. In this that, apart from the messing up the Iraq affair, not the decision to answer, but the way they managed the war, it's mainly an image difference. I mean, Bush will be missed by lots of anti-American radical rhetoric, as well as by American comedians. They have no ability to have material on for the next 4 years, I guess. But when it comes to the assessment of the performance, definitely we all agree that Clinton failed, and Bush did not fail more than Clinton. If anybody failed more, it's the Palestinians through the schism between Hamas and Fatah. You know, you name it. Somalia was a failure because the Americans left, or at least after they failed, it collapsed even more, and that was before the Bush administration. Sudan is even the same. It's really, nothing has collapsed more as a result of Bush, apart from the Iraq thing. Now when it comes to the Iraq thing, I want to revisit the consistency argument, whether you have to actually be consistent. And I think one could present a better argument for the invasion than the one presented. By the way, the one presented was about the nuclear facilities, and that not about removing the dictator. However, I agree with Michael here as well, that you cannot basically attack every dictator, and you have to select. Then you select the worst. And by far the worst is Saddam Hussein. And then you have a situation in Iraq before. I mean, Bush did not create it wasn't like Iraq was well functioning and Bush came and started the war. There was a no-fly zone. Clinton was bombing Iraq, north of Baghdad, before Bush came in. There was a choice. Either you continue the embargo in Iraq, or you change the regime. There was no way to change the regime, as Michael said, other than actually attacking. People like the Southern now are chanting "Death to America," which was a slogan before Bush came to power. It wasn't something that Bush came with. Bush gave this slogan some legitimacy because of the image. It wasn't really created by Bush. But somebody like the Southern, instead of having a stamp of George Bush and worshiping it, because there was no way that the Iranian would have been able to get rid of Saddam for him, who massacred most of his followers throughout the years. So I think, basically, what the Americans are getting a message from the reaction to Iraq is that do the Chinese model. Basically, support whoever delivers. If somebody like Omar al-Bashir massacres 300,000 in Darfur but delivers oil and resources to China, then China will protect him. That's the message sent by the reaction, and not the leader's reaction only, but all the society's reaction to the Iraq situation is that, well, why should we care? This is why when the Americans initially were willing to pressure Saudi Arabia, they became reluctant, because now with the mess in Iraq, they can't afford to lose other allies. So now they start to be softer and softer on everybody else who's with them. So I think it's, again, an opportunity missed. The Americans delivered Saddam to the people, and basically they rejected this gift by saying, look, we want our dictators, we don't want to rule them for us, and that's it.
Okay. Ellen, go ahead.
Michael, it's for you. What concerns me is that if indeed you see an exception, that Iraq is okay, but we cannot take what happened in Iraq and accept it as a premise, like Syria should not be next, or Egypt, or whatever, then what will stop it? If we accept that this is the way that states or superpowers can deal with the world, where is then the rule of law? Where are the limits? Where are the conventions? Where is the UN Charter? Why the United States, not France, tomorrow picks and chooses its dictator? The United Kingdom. Why not a regional power says, I'm the regional power, I don't like this dictator, he's worse than ABC. Once you accept the premise, Michael, you're going to have the rule of the jungle, the law of the jungle.
But that's precisely what you have today, Ellen. I mean, France has its dictators in Africa.
We need to remove them, to make a war, killing hundreds of thousands of the people you pretend to liberate, because you don't like the dictator, and you deem him the worst. Once you accept that this is the premise, then let's change the Charter of the United Nations. Let's change everything.
Let me ask you a question. Under what chapter and verse of the UN Charter or the Charter on Human Rights was Saddam Hussein functioning when he killed probably near 1 million people between the Iraq-Iran war and the unfailed campaigns against the Kurds?
But
No, sorry, I'll just continue the answer. But if I could just...
You misunderstood something I said.
No, what I'm saying is that many times this argument against the US has been made on moral grounds, on international law grounds.
It's brutal. You are assuming that I am speaking like that because I'm defending Saddam Hussein. To hell with Saddam Hussein. I thought he was the worst creature on the face of the earth when the United States was giving him satellite imagery to attack Iran. Okay. I am not a newcomer to this. But why him? Why not then? Once you open the door and you accept that this is the way states could treat one another, there's no end to it.
I understood your question. Let me respond. The point I'm making, first of all, I take a more cynical view of the international community. And when I began answering the question, I understood what you were to say. The fact is that the international community does not function according to the Charter of the United Nations. Should it? Ideally, perhaps it would be great, but the fact is it's not going to happen. France has its dictators in Africa, the United States has its dictators in the Middle East, so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is that we don't live in a moral international order. We don't necessarily live in international law is not like the law of states. It's not something where you take out a book and you say you broke Article 3 of this. International law, to a certain extent, is an ideal concept which you use as a weapon to try to shape the behavior of states, but where you're never going to get, an exact match, or even near an exact match. So when you come and you say, if you open the door towards the removal of regimes, where does it stop? Well, what can I say, except that if you allow tyrannical regimes to stay, you're quite right. The question is, by the way, a perfectly relevant question. I'm not suggesting that you open the door to infinite war. No state can do that anyway. But the fact of the matter is, if the international community is going to be credible, then it really has to behave very differently than it did in Iraq. Because the international community basically allowed Saddam to commit the worst crimes in the 1980s. In the 1990s, the international community saw a sanctions regime over Iraq that killed tens, the estimates, who knows, tens if not hundreds of thousands of people were supposed, you know the figures, the children that died because of the sanctions regime. So that when you come to 2003 and you say, well, how can you justify this? Where does it stop? Well, my argument is, sorry. In 1988, we respected the law of sovereignty. We allowed Saddam to start a war against Iran that killed hundreds of thousands of people. We allowed him to massacre probably in the order of 150 to 200,000 Kurds in the Anfield campaigns in 1988. That's what the international community did. In the 1990s, the sanctions regime, what did it do? It ended up killing normal Iraqis, but Saddam only got stronger, because as his population got weaker, he became stronger. So quite honestly, I don't really share your outrage that in 2003, we got rid of this man. Ultimately, we got rid of this man. We, when I say we, please, I'm speaking as a liberal in the Middle East. Finally, this man was gotten out of power. The debate for me today shouldn't be where does it stop, as far as I'm concerned. Your question is perfectly legitimate. The debate is what in the Arab world should we have done as Arab liberals, and I consider myself an Arab liberal, to take advantage of this moment and actually at the same time send a message to the United States that, look, okay, you got rid of this regime, but at this point Iraq is an independent country. Iraq is not a colony of Paul Bremer. To the credit of the Americans, they understood, alas, 2 years too late, I think, but they understood that they could not manage Iraq under Paul Bremer. They allowed elections and the process began. In all honesty, was the post-Iraq 2003 situation a calamity? It was very bad. But I'm sorry to say, I believe that Iraq, the future of Iraq, is far better today than it would have ever been had Saddam remained in power, and you would have Saddam, and then you would have Qusay, and then you would have Uday, and then you would have had basically one of those terrible regimes on the face of the earth. You're quite right to say, where does it stop? The international community will never sanction a blank check to any country in the world, let's face it. The most powerful country in the world, the United States, today is not willing to remove another regime because of the cost of Iraq. These things cost a lot. So actually, I think there is a natural break in the international community that prevents states from going all the way and removing all the regimes we would like to see removed.
Then thank God for this natural break.
Okay, I think this will be the last question. Yes.
One comment and one question. The comment regards the continuity in American policy in the last 50 years. But I would disagree that there was a continuity under Bush, because you don't forget that there was a Hague Tribunal, there was Kyoto before September 11, and the largest crisis in German-American relations since Konrad Adenauer. And if you look at Poland, that was the time we're from, and when you look at surveys now, Poland was considered the Trojan horse of America in Eastern Europe, and it's so unpopular now, before the last election of Obama.
We were talking about the Middle East.
Yes, but you come and touch it. I think that it's the way of unilateralism. So you do it in this way. But my question is regards something different. But I don't like the term Jewish lobby, because in Eastern Europe, when you say the smart pogroms and the very nasty nationalism, but I know it makes sense here in the Middle East and in the States. But my question regards what Michael Mann wrote a few years ago, was addressing how much money is spent every year for Israel, whenever it's Netanyahu or whenever Israel is leading for a peace. And you both actually stated that America is completely helpless in the Middle East, that it's rather the local government people who should do something. But to my knowledge, America is not supporting Hezbollah or Hamas financially, but it's supporting Israel in financially as well, which is completely understandable as long as it goes for the security of Israeli citizens, but it's probably not understandable when it's the breaking of international law, like settlements and things like that. So do you think that it is completely this issue cannot be done by any American administration. I mean, unconditional support.
Unconditional support for Israel, you mean? Historically, the United States has had sort of varying positions of support for Israel. It's always supported the basic idea of Israel as a Jewish state since its birth. But then you had changes, Eisenhower and others. But since Nixon, since '67, it's been pretty clear. And it's not just because of the pro-Israeli lobby. I don't think that we use the term Jewish lobby. We would say pro-Israeli lobby because some of them are not Jewish. The clear pro-Israeli tilt of the American government has, with only one or two slight exceptions under Bush and Baker and Reagan, slightly very brief interludes, has been extremely clear in terms of that the U.S. is supporting Israel's position on almost all the major conflicts between Israel and the Arabs. It can change, but it won't change under current prevailing conditions. It will change when the price becomes too high. If the price of pursuing this policy becomes too high for American national interest, you'll get the Americans twisting the Israelis' arms. That's not necessarily a good thing because a forced peace agreement is probably not a sustainable one. But I think the better approach is to appeal to the common sense of Israeli public opinion, which broadly, like Palestinian opinion, is prepared for a reasonable compromise. As they were in Northern Ireland and Southern Africa and other places that made historic changes.
This whole question of how the United States must deal with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I think, is it's been recycled so often that what's new? What is there new to say? The fact is that here I'll defend the U.S. to a certain extent. In the 1990s, there was a considerable American effort to come to some kind of an agreement, the Oslo process, the post-Oslo process. At the end of the day, the actors, and I think we should be fair, Arafat as well as Barak, but the actors didn't deliver. Barak didn't deliver on the Syrian front. I'm not one to defend Syria often, but we know what happened in what was the venue, Rami, in
Geneva. White Foundation. White Plantation.
Yeah, I think it was White Plantation. But when Farouk al-Shara arrived to sign the big deal, and Barak basically said, no, I can't make a deal with the Syrians. And of course Camp David, where there is a big debate, what happened at Camp David, and as some of you know, Clinton blamed Arafat. Rob Malley came out with an article with Hussein Agha saying, no, we shouldn't blame Arafat, both sides were to blame. That's an ongoing debate. But the fact of the matter is that the United States in the last decade and a half has its position has fundamentally changed on the Palestinian front. And incidentally, the first president to declare openly support for a Palestinian state was not Bill Clinton, it was George Bush. This is a position that there were fundamentally new positions. I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to the actors themselves to show that they can deliver or not deliver. And when today I hear the pro-Israel lobby, of course the pro-Israel lobby is strong in the United States. We know this. But, more and more, when the United States supports Abbas, that the Palestinian areas are, on the international level, one of the money that has been poured into the Palestinian areas in recent years has been tremendous. In other words, the Palestinians are a legitimate actor on the international level, more than they ever were before. Today, I was interested in hearing Rami say they made a big mistake by supporting Mahmoud Abbas against Hamas. I really don't see that there's much of an alternative in American policy. But the fact of the matter is, at the international level, Abbas is a genuine actor. He's an ineffective actor. I don't think he'll be able, I don't share your optimism. I don't think there will be a unity government soon. But the point I made, to just close, is that, in the absence of a breakthrough on the Palestinian-Israeli front, of course the United States will continue to support Israel. Why should it not support Israel? It has a government, it's a state, it's a functioning state. And this is what the Palestinians and the Arabs must realize, that if you cannot deliver a Palestinian-Israeli peace, and that's not a certainty, what value would the Palestinians have in terms of the international community? And if you replace Hamas with Hamas, let's ask them what value the Palestinians will have in the international community. Trust me, it won't have any value. And that's unfortunately the problem. And you can't always blame the United States for that. What does the Palestinians, and I'm not one to blame the victims solely in terms of the Palestinians, but these are hard questions we have to answer.
I want to thank Michael and Rami and all of you for staying here so long. Thank you very much.